Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Derrick Houle. I operate a ISP, and we operate out of Musquetees, Alberta, right now. And we're looking at providing services to all First Nations and rural communities. So I'm going to try to break down in 30 minutes or less 150 years of history, economic inequality. So the digital divide was created. It's only recent that we have the terminology of digital divide. Since 1999, there's been, well, it's actually started long before then. If everyone is old enough to remember the first cell phones and the first technology that came out, that type of technology was so advanced at that time. This is late 70s, early 80s, that it was unfathomable to consider that everyone would have that. You know, when we had the boom boxes, we had the cassette tapes, we transferred from like early wax recordings to vinyl recordings to 8-tracks to cassettes to to CDs to DVDs to now we're in digital territory. All of that has happened in our lifetimes, and the reality is that most communities were not prepared to take that in as an economic asset. It was never created in communities that, oh yeah, we might be able to use this as a resource, because a lot of communities were just trying to actually get food, water, shelter for the communities. So having the luxuries of technology wasn't that important. I myself grew up in a house which did not have running water for the first part of my life, and we didn't have electricity. So that kind of change in one's lifetime has created a lot of missed opportunities, for lack of a better word, that First Nations communities are just catching up to what the urban setting is. And we have the experience, I would say, in most cases, where we're always we're comparing our current lifestyle and what we have accessible to us to what's actually going on in urban settings. So now that we have Facebook and now we have YouTube, we went through the MTV generation, we have a vision of what technology can provide to us, and that's the gangbanger lifestyle, the whatever celebrity you follow type of existence, where they have all the gold and chains and everything else, but we still don't have running water. So we still don't have access to our services. So it's really created a mixed bag of priorities for a lot of First Nations people. And what I'm looking at is, by doing this work and being aware of what the economic reality is, I've had to look at what the last 150 years of the treaty is, and specifically Treaty 6. So Treaty 6 was created in 1876, and prior to that, the reason why they were sent out to sign treaty is because they were trying to put through the railway and the telegraph system, and that was being stopped. And so in order to make sure that they could push that through the territory, they had to find a way to have that happen. So they came out and they created the Treaty Commission to come out and get that done. Now, a lot of things about treaties that most people don't know is that they were created post-meeting. So whatever was actually there, what was said, and this is the argument that First Nations use a lot, is that we had an intent, a meaning and intent. What the treaty meant to us was not what was written down. So a lot of things that were actually included weren't what we said or what we believed in. So when we're looking at it, they could only see as far as they could see back then. They could see that, you know, this advancement of technology with the railway and the telegraph was going to have an impact. And again, then they were concerned with how they were going to feed their nations, their tribes, their bands. And that was a major concern, because up to that point, the Canadian government had a methodology of trying to create a system where they didn't have to support the system for long term. So the mentality was they were creating reserves and all these agreements that they would only have to live for 20 years. They put a lifespan on it. And so that they would eventually not have to fulfill any more of their agreements. And that's the mentality that's continued, is that all the agreements that are in place with the government of Canada, quote unquote government, is are based on a time frame. They're expected to lapse. They won't be honored for the duration of why, for the duration of First Nations existence, because they created so many things to create, to remove First Nations from the Canadian landscape. Let's try to put it that way. I'm trying to be as gentle as possible in my wording, because it does create a lot of triggers. But the reality is, people think the system is broken, and it's not broken. The economic design that was created was purposeful in eliminating First Nations communities. It was created so that we have incumbents coming in, regardless of the time frame. When the treaty was created, it came with the Indian Act, and the Indian Act basically said that, you know, these are not people. These are as equivalent to cows or whatever livestock that had no value at the time. And that was the mindset. And so eventually, over generations, things changed, and that the Indian Act changed, but the treaty never did. So now we have a situation where the Indian Act has been stripped down so far that it actually allows for First Nations communities to gain access to their own resources in a way which was never present before then. And it still, though, because of the methodology that the government has used, has created a system where, in order to get access to any resources on reserve, the community has to hire a third-party, non-community entity to put in applications on their behalf, to associate the money, or to disperse that money to whatever the project is, to off-reserve entities who will do all the work for the community, and none of that money actually stays with the community. So it's a black hole of economic progress, because as much as the government and the intention is to better the communities based on what they're doing, the economic access in participating in the building of the community and building capacity and everything else does not exist. So we have a lot of people in the nations who have been trained in this way, that, okay, the government says that they're going to do this, so they hire a non-native organization to administrate the whole project and to give them an end result. That end result always bleeds the community. So whatever economic input would have benefited them, it always, and I would ask anyone to show me a different model of something that actually doesn't, it always ends up in the resources of the nation going out to a third-party incumbent, which does not return to the nation. And so that's the way the system has been designed, and it works that way. So I'm just trying to create an alternative for communities to see that they can actually own their infrastructure, they can own their services, and that's the best way to change this economic model. Because as long as First Nations communities understand that they can take on these services themselves, they can take on the actions of what has actually been prepared for them by the government, they have the ability to change that economic model so that they can retain the money that's going out and they can build out their capacity, which isn't the model that is actually subscribed to. So there's a lot of things that have happened in the last 150 years, especially with First Nations communities, and with the changes in legislation and everything. And it's still, the simplistic version of it is that First Nations are not allowed to run their own economies. So you have oil and gas coming in, creating deals with communities to sell pipelines and that kind of resource, which is also a First Nation resource. But the way the agreements are set up are also an economic bleed. You have incumbents right now with the UBF being created who are benefiting 100% from the government spend rather than the communities, because the structure of the applications and the way they're designed ensures that the First Nations community does not have control of the asset. And because there's an unfair relationship there, most of the First Nations won't know and won't understand, especially because there's always a transfer of information, which is always late. And because the communities have a 3-year leadership cycle, there is no continuity in how we actually can create an effective change or manage those resources. So there's a lot of things that impact First Nations communities when it comes to what can work and what can't. But the reality for right now is that the system works perfectly well. It was designed that way to make sure that First Nations communities don't have the economic ability that other organizations would have. If you look into all the systems, there's always the end game is always that the economic benefit goes off reserve. So that's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. So knowing that, and knowing that the legislations have changed and the government has been trying to do reconciliation, they have missed a lot of areas where they could do better. So one of the areas that they can do better is consultation. Since 1976, when the Berger inquiry was started, there was an expectation for fiduciary responsibility to be met. And a lot of these agreements today that are standing have not met fiduciary responsibility, especially when it comes to the federal government and making sure and ensuring that the communities have fair access or control or even participation in their own projects. So since 1999, there's been spectrum sales in Alberta, which means that the airspace over First Nations communities has been sold to the general, to incumbents in Canada for the access of cellular networks, of anything that goes through the airwaves. And those spectrum sales in Canada have amassed a large amount of revenue for the Canadian government, which has not been shared with First Nations communities to this date. So what that means, and this is something that everyone can take away and they can participate in, is that ISED has opened up a consultation process, which is closing on October 21st. So if anyone has interest in making an impact in telling the government what is working, what is not working in the system, they have the opportunity. So that's going to be made available after this. And I just want to make sure that people have an understanding that the stuff that we work on in this field actually is related to all the industries that are affecting First Nations communities. So oil and gas, power, telephone lines, any infrastructure that's in the community is actually owned by the First Nation. However, based on the agreements, it's typical for the incumbents in each one of those industries to create agreements that say that the First Nation community does not have access or does not have ownership or control of those assets. So this is just the way the system was created, and having the ability to change all those agreements is now available to all First Nations, which is only recent, because, you know, until the 60s, First Nations communities were not allowed to have a lawyer. So, you know, we're only looking at close to 80 years where we've had the ability to have some sort of impact in our own representation, especially when it comes to our own communities and everything else. So there's a lot of movement in the First Nations communities to establish self-government, self-determination, what that looks like, take ownership of our kinship, of the way we have any impact in the community. So especially as First Nations people, one of the things that is important to know is that we're not all the same. Every treaty group has a different culture, a different understanding of what's important to them, and that when we do the pan-Indian thing, it really waters down who we are as nations in Canada, because we are distinct, we are unique. We have different cultural understandings of who we are and how we got to where we are. And that's why what I'm doing when I present to First Nations communities, it's about what's important to them. So my methodology is to find out what's important to them first, and creating an agreement which is actually in their benefit. Now, it might not be a wise business model from the non-native perspective. However, for me, it's not so much about profit. It's actually about creating the economic security and the future of the next 7 generations. I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but we've had 7 monarchs since the creation of the treaty. And, you know, if we're looking at the 7 future monarchs, what kind of a land, what kind of a community will we have if we're able to take control of all those aspects of our nations and develop them in a way which actually works to our benefit? The next 150 years and all the technology changes and everything that's going to happen, I cannot predict all of that, but I know that if we are in a position where we have the ability to make choices, healthy choices for ourselves in every aspect of our lives, including water, food, all the things that Maslow learned from the Southern tribes. You know, if we have access to all of that as individuals without government constraint, without industry constraint, without the greed that is prevalent in those systems, maybe we have a chance of at the next generations of our people to have better lives, to have better outcomes, to have healthier homes, to have security for once in the last 150 years since this agreement was created, to actually have that security that was being talked about at that time. Because that's why we entered, or that's why the treaty was signed, was to try to create safety for the nations that signed it. Even though that wasn't probably the first thing on their mind when they created it, which I obviously shared with you, is the telegraph and the railroad. That's what they wanted to get. So this is where I'm at with the things that I'm doing, and I just wanted to make sure that people have the ability to research everything that I say. So everything I say is challengeable, and the beauty of that is that you'll come up against what's there for you in looking at the history. Whatever you've been taught in school, you'll definitely learn more, because that is an incomplete history. And if we understand the systems of histories in the provinces, it's owned by the province. So whatever flavor they want to put on that gumbo is what you get, right? So, but the reality is we have the opportunity to learn more, to express ourselves more, and to take the technology that's going to be available to us, especially right now, and in ownership, and use that to our advantage. The economic, the industry of telecommunications in this country makes 50+ billion a year, and that's not including all the auxiliary or the attached ways of making money to that. So your YouTube, your Facebook, your all those other application based sources of income will become available to First Nations communities once they get access. Now, right now, the stats are pretty sad. We don't have as much access as First Nation or other communities near us, because the way the system is set up is that once a sale happens in Alberta, there is a set-aside program, but it doesn't actually have to support or supply service to First Nations communities. It's based on numbers. So if there's an economic benefit to an incumbent to use a different community in order to meet that criteria, then that's what they do. They don't include the services typically for First Nations communities because there's not enough economic impact on their bottom line. We have a lot of factors that are there for the investment not to be made, even though the government in the last 2 years has put out a lot of money to create these networks. The government created a system where there's monopolies. So First Nations communities are actually entrenched in monopolies that they can't get out of because, first of all, they didn't know that they were in a monopoly. Second of all, they didn't know that the government had created these agreements with the incumbents, and that that whole system, which is still working perfectly, was actually in existence. So it's just a lot of information that has been passed to nations, and that it's going to take some education to first identify and then come up with a solution on how we manage that. So in telecommunications, this is one of the things that I'm working on, is to create the economic impact by creating ownership for First Nations, and to support that entirely in whatever way I can, so that they get the economic benefit for once in all these years, compared to all the incumbents which are government funded. So that's my talk.
Great, thank you so much, Derrick. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure there'll be perhaps questions and comments later. So I'd like to welcome our second speaker, Michael Lithgow, who researches citizen engagement in public cultures and the implications of communication for shaping relations of power. His current focus is on critical technology practices, including broadband initiatives in rural and remote communities in North and South America, and decoloniality applied to the material infrastructure of digital cultures. He also studies knowledge translation in artists and residencies and their implications for social transformation and the response of professional journalists, news organizations, and audience to the rise of user-generated content. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Katie. So I'll just share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint to sort of trundle along with my my words here. Do you have the screen there?
We see the presenter view, not the presented view. Like we can see your notes.
Oh, let's see here.
We have to switch screens if you have two monitors.
How about if I just unplug one of them?
You might need to unshare and reshare,
Okay.
or unslideshow.
How about that?
Yep, we can see it. Yep, that's great.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Derrick. So as Derrick eloquently described, the digital divide is a persistent condition, excluding Indigenous, poor, rural, and remote and other communities from the advantages of having access to ICT network technologies. And we've all seen that condition accelerated and amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020-2021. One of the ongoing responses to this lack has come from scholars and practitioners working with communities to create locally owned and operated ICT infrastructure, or what I'm going to refer to as community networks in this talk. Community networks are intended to serve local needs, and researchers have documented a range of benefits encompassing sociocultural, political, and economic outcomes. One of the key tensions to emerge from research into community network development is sustainability. The question of why and how some networks flourish in communities while others flounder and fail remains a central concern. Now, the question of sustainability is not, as it might seem at first, an economic question only, and Derrick talked about this in some of his approaches to smoke signals. The networks I've studied have not been for-profit enterprises. There are no shareholders looking to maximize returns, no corporate boards focused on profitability, no market share to secure. Instead, we find communities who want and need broadband communication networks and who are in fact underserved by market forces, and that the infrastructure either doesn't exist or what is available is unreliable or unaffordable, or often both. By choosing an other than market-oriented model of enterprise organization, stakeholders are afforded more room for creative problem solving, which can often mean the difference between the survivability of a community network and its demise. Another factor that I've come to appreciate in the development of community networks is how the technologies chosen can shape community relations. Traditional models of broadband technology centralize infrastructure. This usually requires considerable capital investment to build large data pipelines or lease them. Users engage directly with a commercial ISP, not each other. Centralized infrastructure makes it easier for ISPs to monitor and manage the data flowing through their system. And this isn't something we usually take into account, but it tends to minimize the need for users to understand how the system works. And this reflects what most of us probably experience in our own use of the internet. We pay an ISP for services. ISP means internet service provider. If something goes wrong, a technical expert is sent to fix the problem. We have little or no direct contact with other users in the system. And the model works, and it works very well in many scenarios. But the scenarios that I'm talking about today is where this model, the private market model, fails to serve a community's needs. Community networks are aimed at filling this gap. It's important to keep in mind that broadband networks are a form of infrastructure. Basic systems and services that a country or community or organization needs in order to function. Infrastructure can encompass road and railway networks, utilities, sewage, water, air control towers, bridges, law enforcement, healthcare, emergency services, education, and telecommunications. The cell towers, the transmitters, the fiber optic cables, the telephone wires, the satellites, and internet exchanges that make up the telecommunication systems of a given place. Infrastructure shares certain kinds of characteristics. They are difficult to create. They require technical complexity, significant capital investment. They often involve complex legal and regulatory regimes, and often need sophisticated political relationships to be realized, perhaps extending over vast geographic areas. Infrastructures serve generally inelastic demands for services and benefits. So for example, health, water and sewage, electricity, transportation are all needs that infrastructure provides amenities for that are more or less needed by everybody in a society, and it's regardless of any economic ups or downs. These are just ongoing requirements for a society to function. Infrastructure is expected to have a long life. So once that investment of time and energy goes into creating, it's expected to last for a considerable period of time. And infrastructure, after it's created, often recedes into the background and becomes invisible. And this is part of how infrastructure exercises considerable power over the communities where it exists. People start to take it for granted and stop thinking about the ways that it organizes bodies and people in time and space. Telecommunications infrastructure demonstrates all of these characteristics. So a critical aspect of infrastructure is its role in creating and perpetuating and expanding particular social orders. Infrastructures instantiate authority and power as many studies have demonstrated, by materializing policies and knowledge practices, by organizing social life based on categories of class, race, gender, kinship, and so on, by distributing resources and social relations temporally and geographically, and by extending and performing empire and state building, much as Derrick was describing. Media infrastructures, like ICT networks, similarly embody processes of distribution and allocation of resources by materializing physical structures, labor, hardware, software, and regulating bodies through temporal and geographic spaces. And these kinds of outcomes have implications for lived realities. So for example, telecommunications infrastructure can regulate the temporal and geographic reach of social change. It can facilitate the independence and growth of institutions and organizations. It can create vulnerabilities to centralized forms of governance and decision-making. It can establish particular protocols for information sharing, and it can create opportunities for building capacities relevant to political and economic agency and independence. I described earlier the centralized model for ICT infrastructure, the one most of us are probably familiar with, centralized authority over the infrastructure itself, over the expertise required to maintain and expand the networks, over any financial returns on network operations, and over regulating the use of the network. A very different model from this being used around the world to bridge the digital divide is called mesh network technology. This is a form of network design that, among other technical differences, allows access to the internet through the direct link between one node and another. And what I mean by this in practical terms is that, as you can see on the PowerPoint, is that networks are built house by house, home by home, user by user. In order to connect to the network, you have to link to another user. Your receiver, antenna, transmitter go on the roof or some other high point. It receives a signal from another user or node, and it becomes a possible source of the network signal for someone else. And this is how a mesh network grows, house by house, apartment by apartment, user by user over geographic territories. The backhaul for the system, by which I mean access to the internet, is shared throughout the network. So one access point to the internet can serve a large number of users, and there can be many backhaul access points serving the same network. Mesh networks can be independent of the internet, so still providing the community with the advantages of local sharing and communication without any direct links to the World Wide Web. In one community that I visited, an economically underserved Zapotec indigenous community in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, they created a local mesh network to serve the community that wasn't linked to the internet. In this community, expensive and unreliable internet access was available through commercial providers from outside the community, but it was an economically very poor community, and so most users had to buy time chits, and their access to the internet was regulated on a minute-by-minute pay-as-you-go framework. So what community members did is they created the mesh network. They would take resources from the internet, repost them on the mesh network that would allow community members to access without having to pay a third party. And this was especially important for the students at a community-created university to access materials relevant to their classes. The social implications of mesh network technology may or may not be readily apparent. If, for example, a state wants to cut off a community from a network in the commercial model, they can restrict data flow at one of the centralized points on which the commercial networks depend. It's easy to do. In a mesh network, every node would have to be shut down to eliminate the network. Similarly, the distributed nature of a mesh network makes it virtually impossible to monitor data. This is unlike a commercial system where centralized flow points make it very easy for states or anyone else to track data. But perhaps the most relevant advantage to this conversation today is that the cost of building a mesh network is nominal compared to a conventional system. Each node can be acquired for as little as between $50 and $100. There's open source software available for running the network, and increasingly open source hardware, as was the case with the networks I studied in Argentina and Mexico. Mesh networks aren't wired, so there's no trenching to dig cables or leasing telephone poles to hang wires. They're comparatively easy to create. The distributed nature of the network translates into a distributed sharing of infrastructure costs. There's, of course, challenges, the most dynamic of which, from my perspective, is that mesh networks require users to be involved far more than in a commercial system. Being involved generally means knowing more about the technology and understanding how to both set it up and troubleshoot. It may mean taking workshops or losing network connection and not being able to solve the problem because you can't get someone to help you in a timely manner. One architect that we spoke to in Argentina, when we asked him why he stays with the community network and doesn't just pay for a service, said that, yeah, sometimes he wanted to take his antenna node, throw it in his driveway and run over it with his car. But what keeps him involved in was the community relations aspect of how mesh network technology works. So belonging to a mesh network may mean learning how to keep books or accounting, or collecting money from neighbors, or organizing a barbecue social, or having to knock on your neighbor's door to ask them to realign their antenna, or maybe getting a wasp nest out of a router, or fixing a badly crimped cable running from your antenna to your computer, and so on. Mesh networks require community involvement in a way that centralized commercial models don't. So on the one hand, builds capacity among community members, provides a radically affordable and more private alternative to commercial systems, and builds community relations because node owners have to work together to build and manage the network. On the other, it makes demands on time and requires users to engage collectively with their neighbors to solve network problems. In Cordova, Argentina, I did research into the longevity of 5 community networks ranging in age from 4 to 8 years at the time, and they were all using LibreMesh technology. It's open source software developed by a group based in Argentina called Altermundi. The URL for the website's on the screen. And what emerged in this study is that longevity for these community networks was related in each case to the ways that community members were brought into organizational competency through social events, through political affiliation, technical interest or experience, accounting expertise, sometimes teaching opportunities. These community networks have been successful in developing communities of practice who could sustain and grow the network. Mesh networks exist on some very large scales, the largest in the world being the Wi-Fi net in the Catalan region of Spain, which has close to 40,000 user nodes. And this is from their website. Wi-Fi net is a bottom-up, citizenship-driven technological, social, and economic project with the objective of creating free, open, and neutral telecommunications network based on a commons model. The development of this common pool infrastructure eases access to equality, fair price telecommunications in general, and broadband internet connections in particular for everybody. And the URL there is in the PowerPoint. There's dozens of mesh networks operating in the US, including New York City, Baltimore, Seattle, Philadelphia, Santa Fe, and a bunch of others. And in Canada, there's mesh network projects in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Halifax, Ottawa, and a growing number of rural and remote communities. For Indigenous communities in particular, the First Mile Connectivity Consortium has been exploring the potential of mesh networks in communities in Northern Alberta and British Columbia. There's other examples of large community mesh networks, including Freifunk in Germany, Sorrentaporo Wireless Community Network in Greece, the Libre Router networks in Argentina. And here's a URL for a long list of mesh networks operating around the world. So mesh network organizational models have manifested many different forms, from the community-owned and operated model that I've been describing to public utilities, often owned by municipal governments, to private companies, public-private partnerships, and cooperatives. So the management of a mesh network can take on many different forms. In summary, the design of a mesh network technology is critical to the kinds of community relations that emerge around and through networks that are created. Mesh networks allow a distributed sharing of infrastructure costs. The technologies used are widely available, inexpensive, and often open source. The user-to-user nature of the network requires that community relationships be strengthened alongside network relations. So in other words, mesh networks decentralize and distribute throughout the network costs, maintenance demands, and collaborative problem solving, which are key variables in creating and sustaining solutions to the ongoing problems of the digital divide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. So we have some time now for question and answers. So if anyone has a question, you can feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well. While people are thinking, I'm wondering, sorry, I'm just trying to do a couple of things at once here. I'm wondering maybe Michael and Derrick, if you might talk a bit about, some of the, or elaborate a bit more on some of the challenge of user capacity and control in increasing access, and what are the kind of joys and challenges of that in your work?
I can actually talk to that. It's a lot of stuff that Michael shared was actually something that we've looked at for First Nations communities. One of the things that comes up though as a challenge is that we don't have any in the current system, the government will pay for infrastructure in First Nations communities. However, they won't give anything for operation and maintenance. So we actually have to create an economic model which generates enough revenue to be able to take care of all that infrastructure, because it's not free, and it's costly, and it has a lifespan. So looking at that, there's a lot of policies and that we have to create, especially when it comes to information management nowadays, because there is a government a government-backed process to gather as much information from First Nations for different purposes. I won't say that they're insidious, but there is a lot of information being gathered. And if First Nations don't create the policies to protect themselves and their nations and their cultures and their identities, especially when it comes to the new infrastructure that's going to be created and the future infrastructure, which will automatically track who you are as a human being and what your value is to the economy. Those are important factors that I'm looking into, because this whole conversation about who we are, like everyone started with a pronoun this morning. In my language, that doesn't exist. So I don't identify with that, whatever you call it, that colloquialism for today's communications. Whereas in communities, whatever we create, that identity becomes sellable on the market for government networks and for any of these actors who make money or profit off of First Nations identity. So it's important for us to create the policies, to create the revenue source, to be able to fund the activities of protecting our communities, and to really develop our footprint so that it can have a lasting impact for the future generations, especially when it comes to language. For anyone who was anyone who remembers the previous Trudeau's version of what a First Nations person is that a person is First Nations if they have their language. And so his whole premise of government was to eliminate language, so that the whole community no longer had an identity, that they no longer had the distinctiveness of who they are. And so when I'm creating my network, my business, it's to create the resource to protect as much as we can to, it's not to go back into a Neolithic state. We're not trying to de-evolve. We're just trying to maintain and support as much as we can the existing cultural identity that we have with the tools that we have. So if we don't create the economic recovery and the investment into communities, then it becomes so much easier for the institutions that exist to take from First Nations communities, especially if we don't have those policies and structures which we can take to a courtroom and to say that we identify ourselves as this, and it's really difficult. So mesh networks are actually a really great idea, and they will work in certain cases. One thing that I come up against right now is protection. So we do have a lot of nasty actors on the web, and we do have a system in place in Canada, which is called ICE, to I don't know the whole name, it's just the acronym, and they look at monitoring for human trafficking and protection of children and everything else. And First Nations communities have a huge amount of possibility of being taken advantage of. And we know this already because of the cases that have already existed off reserve of how much human trafficking and the destructive nature of people can, have an impact on other people's lives when it comes to the digital realm. And so if we don't create that control and that structure, it basically, for me, in my case, I'm trying to create the barrier and a healthy environment. And whatever that looks like is still undefined, because not all communities are doing this, or have the ability to do it, because they don't even have the infrastructure to even create the network to be able to create that. So that's what I'm looking at for being possible right now. Michael?
Well, and Derrick, you can correct me if I'm wrong in this. I think a piece of that puzzle is the technical capacity of the community members, right? Is the ability of community members to sort of engage in a sort of knowledgeable and agential way, both setting up the infrastructures and then taking advantage of them and using them for whatever purposes, like protocols of what information gets shared and what information doesn't get shared and who gets to access that information. So Katie, I mean, that's for me, and that's also my kind of area of research interest but that's definitely one of the pieces in the communities that I was looking at, is people struggled with the technology. And so, I mean, the technologies were like these networks often emerge out of they call themselves geeks. It's sort of the, it's the computer people, right? That are coming from outside the community. In the cases in Argentina, they moved into the community, they bought homes, and so they became part of the community. But there's sort of people with technical expertise coming in, and then people that are just living their lives trying to figure out, how do I do my antenna? How does this all work, right? So that's a huge piece of the puzzle. And I think there's a lot of work there to be done. And I think there's an enormous potential for people to take on a lot more technical literacy than generally speaking people have. Like, so when those commercial ISPs and those incumbents, they've also centralized expertise in a way that makes it very, like that also restricts who can participate in the decision making, who can go to the CRTC public hearings and have a knowledgeable question to ask, because they understand what the implications are of certain kinds of technical decisions. So I think the technical literacy piece is really, really, really important. But the other thing we observed was that wasn't what everybody had to bring. So the communities that I worked in had a referente system, they called it. And so there were certain people that emerged that liked the tech, they were good at it, and so they were the go-to people, right? It was all volunteer, nobody was being paid. They were the go-to people, right? But other people were really good at teaching. So then it emerged that it was really important to have educators involved in the capacity building around a community-owned and operated network, because people need to learn stuff. They need to learn either the technical stuff, or they need to learn accounting, or sometimes even just being able to sit in or manage a meeting. There's a capacity piece there of understanding how meetings work and sitting in meetings and decision making collectively. Or sometimes it was the social aspect of the mesh network that drew people in and kept them there. They loved meeting their neighbors. They loved feeling part of a community that was working towards something that gave them, either free or extremely affordable access. So it was all of those capacity pieces that became really crucial to the longevity of the community networks that I looked at.
That's so great. Thank you both. And I think, it's kind of interesting to think about in the context of intergenerational thinking, right? Like, how does that get passed down? Who takes responsibility for it? And who, stays in community? We've heard through our sessions that one of the challenges in rural and remote communities is that people leave. So who, takes that work on? Josie, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, Derrick. How are you? Hope you're doing well. Nice to see you.
Nice, surprised. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation. A few years ago, just when the COVID-19 pandemic started, we did a survey and we did some focus group stuff, like with Indigenous students who were like in cities, towns, reserves across Canada, and there was like a huge gap in being able to access, everything from public buildings to use computers, to internet, and to everything, even to band offices to access internet. So they had a real difficulty like in completing courses, and the impact, of course, like on their self-esteem, because when you don't have access to stuff and you have barriers and challenges, that creates that sense of you don't feel good because you're not accomplishing the things that you need to. And I find it just a fascinating topic, like to kind of like elaborate on, and I think that this is something that's worthy of more. Like Janelle Baker and I, we did an article with in the conversation, and it just focused like on the COVID-19 pandemic, but the stuff that you guys are talking about here, I find very interesting, because in researching like my own community, Big Stone Cree Nation, and some of our history, we had the first like Idle No More walk, I would say, in the 1970s. Back when Chief William Beaver was the chief, actually 82 around there, and they walked from Wabasca to Edmonton, which is like a 4-hour drive, 4.5-hour drive on pavement. So they walked, and it took them a long time. And by the time they got to Edmonton, they had met with various ministers and so forth to pursue economic development, and they wanted to have like opportunities to enhance their livelihood. And this is a treaty right. Livelihood is a treaty right. If you don't have your internet, you don't have a livelihood. For myself, I have to live in Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory, mainly because my daughter is going to school here, my youngest, but also because internet is really expensive when you only have one provider in rural Alberta. And my experience is the same experience as the students like up in the Northwest Territories when they're talking about like one provider and so much broadband width. So I think that this is I'm just wanting to make the comment that I think that this is something continuing to worth pursuing and to work on. And that information that we were working on was only published like in the conversation, and I worked with Dr. Connors and Janelle Baker on that one as well, and as a grad student. Yeah.
Thanks, Josie, and thanks for mentioning that research, which came out when I first joined AU and has been really informative in how I think about accessibility here. I put the link in the chat to the conversation piece that you mentioned. Michael or Derrick, I don't know if you want to add or comment on what Josie has shared.
Oh, just I wanted to add to like this whole treaty perspective, and like looking at like revisiting even like, you talk about in the news about like people talking about the Constitution, again, revisiting the Constitution and how Indigenous legal traditions need to be included because the Canadian Constitution is incomplete, is what John Burroughs is saying. So.
Thanks, Josie.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I actually had a question from Michael. I mean, I've been working on this internet concern for a little while now. The government, it's a utility. It's required by everybody. Doesn't matter where you go. We all need access to it. The problem is the price tag and the infrastructure to actually put it in place. What's the solution that you see? Because truth is, I can't find one that's going to be financially realistic. There's one solution that I've actually been pushing for our county, and I think that's the only way to go, and that'll be Starlink. Because again, what company is going to want to put in the $10 million or $1 billion or whatever amount it is to get it to certain areas of northern Alberta or northern Canada for that matter, and then the price tag of reaching a handful of people? No company's going to find any financial feasibility in that.
Can I answer?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, I thank you, Aaron, for bringing that up. That's exactly why I started the company that I started, is because there are so many gaps in the infrastructure, and part of this is that it was the history is that it's all government funded, right? Mm-hmm. Infrastructure in Canada and Alberta a lot of it is old and decrepit, and it's not going to be reinvested in. But the reality is that whatever is available to First Nations communities is also just as it's just as far off for the rural communities that aren't on the normal legs. So and creating a system that actually works, because the amount of money that's actually gone into all these incumbents to date would more than finance a fiber line to your community, probably 10 times over. And that's the reality of it, is that the amount of money that's been taken out of technology to now from its inception is no reason to justify why there's communities in Canada anywhere that don't have stable connections. And
Derek,
that's,
it's always the looking forward stage. Like, I mean, I understand, like, looking backwards at the money that was spent, it's atrocious. I mean, like, the stuff with my position now, I can't believe the spending that actually went on. But getting support to move it forward, when you're looking at that overall number, because the government, they do have some money put to the side of it, but it's nowhere near what is going to be required. And then as technology changes as well, owning that infrastructure is not in the interest of individual communities, because the price, because as it changes over time, you're not going to be able to get the upgrades, and the price tag of upgrading everything is going to get more and more. And like you said, getting fiber to a certain area and going from wireless from that point, that does reach, but you got to remember all the valleys, the trees, the difference of areas that are trying to be reached. You have to have some sort of line of sight. Well, that's really not going to work for most people that are in our community.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're doing this, is because looking forward, there's a model that can be created in order to generate enough revenue to be able to, so to provide that. But it actually, based on my evaluation of things, it is not just going to be a for-profit that can do it alone, or a community that can do it alone, right? It has to be a blend. And looking at what's actually available out there, the CRTC discussion, I threw it into the chat. So for anybody who wants to make a submission to them, this is part of that conversation, is to make sure that all money that is taken in by the CRTC, or ISED, that goes into general coffers, is actually made available to public. And that's what my major push is, because this is not their money, right? They're putting into general revenues, when that specific amount of money that's generated from spectrum sales specifically, which is in the public interest, should be put back to the public.
Agreed. And the spectrum sales is a whole nother animal that you have to go after, because I mean, when they sell the spectrum to a certain community, they're looking at it going, well, the community, you have to go with X amount of space. Well, they see where the numbers are and they focus on that, but why would they build out the numbers where it's smaller? So now nobody can get in that section because of the spectrum issues.
Exactly, and this is where it has to change.
Agreed.
I
That
wonder,
would be a good spot.
Michael, I wonder if you want to add something here in terms of sort of community approaches and the lower.
Yeah, I mean,
infrastructure.
definitely, and obviously, I suppose every community is going to sort out solutions that suit the needs of the community, right? So, I mean, I know that, I think in Maskwacis, I think Starlink had made some approaches to Mamawapwan when Mamawapwan was operating there, and so, but Starlink's not inexpensive either. I mean, it's not like Starlink simply provides, right? I mean, it's quite an expensive service, and one can only assume that the expenses go up. And also, the community has no control over any of the infrastructure whatsoever, or use and control of the data flow, or all those things. So there's other kinds of costs to be taken into account. Aaron, you must be aware of all of the broadband funds that were created through the CRTC, and then I think Industry Canada had them. I mean, those are really big dollar funds to create infrastructure for rural communities. So the federal government did create those funding opportunities to build out infrastructure in some ways.
But having access to them is the most difficult, because the specs that are put on getting those funds are not just, hey, we'll start this up, send a letter to the government for money. It's so difficult, it seems.
You have to partner with somebody who's been an ISP for at least 3 years. Yeah. Well, and then, I mean, you're right. I mean, these are all extremely difficult
Hurdles.
Problems, and the solutions created by the state they serve state interests in the end, right? The communities that I worked with using mesh network technology were in comparable situations. And that's partly why mesh network works for them. I mean, it's not fiber optics. So, you're working with different kinds of data speeds with a mesh network. You're working with wireless data speeds. But in the 5 communities that we studied, they had one backhaul access that they got through a university at night. During the daytime, they had a much more constricted data flow, but at night they get access. And then that one backhaul was ported from tower to tree to tower to tree to this community. Yeah. And then all the houses there, and then up to the top of the hill, down the hill to that community, right? So, I mean, it's not state of the art. It's not fiber optic broadband access, right? But there are workable solutions
Yes.
that provide at least a limited capacity for access. But you don't need a lot of money to build up that centralized infrastructure. You need a source of backhaul. And that's, I guess, the hard part, is getting the point of presence, right? So that you have that initial spot and then sharing that through the mesh.
Yeah. So getting the fiber to that one spot and then teeing it off from there.
And then sharing that out to a wider geographic area. And it's line of sight. So you gotta put and that's the other thing too, is in Canada, I realized that mesh networks are harder because we're so not used to climbing up on our roofs with an antenna and a transmitter and screwing around with it and crimping cables and doing all that. So there's a huge learning piece. This is happening in the States quite a bit, right? Where they're working in largely urban centers, but it's happening in Indigenous communities in the States as well, where they're building out mesh networks and building up that technical capacity, but there is a learning curve. It's steep.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I want to just bring a couple comments from the chat to everyone. So Leona has also said, the only model we know is private sector corporate. Is there any room for cooperatives or for government owned or operated, such as with rural electrification in the 1950s and telephones before that? So thinking about other models of provision. And Valentin has also mentioned that with his nonprofit, they're doing a pilot project right now where they're deploying edge computing and mesh network in a bunch of countries, and provided a link if you're curious. Yeah, Valentin, go ahead. You can speak to it, sure.
Well, I didn't plan to say anything, but essentially it ripples down to a lot of research we're doing across different countries in the state of connectivity. And I think one overlay element that we keep seeing is having solutions that are very low cost and, as Derrick mentioned, very easy to maintain in terms of infrastructure.
Yes.
Everything is beautiful until you realize that the maintenance cost is what ultimately is the highest cost, not just the acquisition cost. I know I talk very in business terms, but it turns out that when I did a lot of nonprofit work in West Africa and Latin America, you'll see those old infrastructures that were built on beautiful ideas and beautiful and hopes. And the true difficulty with technology is to make something that lasts even 5 or 10 years. If you can do that at a good price, this is truly impressive. And that's, I think, what we need a lot for rural broadband. And also for those who are curious, there's also I'm working on a white paper with IEEE related to rural broadband. So for those who are curious, there's also some more information you can get there. There's a lot of interesting projects going on right now. That's it.
Thank you so much. Great. Well, thank you everyone for such a dynamic conversation and panel. What we'd like to do now is move into our breakout room. So there'll be options that you can select from, and the questions are here in the chat as well. So the first room will be around how to support communities in increasing internet access. The second question is around community ownership. So is that something you could see working in your community? Why or why not?
Do you want to do 3 or 2?
We can do 2, sure.
Okay.
And then, so the breakout rooms will pop up. If you don't see them, if you click breakout room at the bottom of your screen, it should pop up, and you can choose whichever room you're most interested in. And it's okay if the conversation is freewheeling and goes elsewhere from the question. And we will then come back to the room in about 12 minutes, and I'll ask the groups to share a little bit that came up. So enjoy your breakout rooms.
What?
I just had a question coming out of my room. If we can just
great.
Continue it real quick.
Thank you so much. So I work for the provincial government. I'm in the Grand Prairie Provincial Building in Alberta. I've been doing economic development for over 20 years. I am trained in participatory action research, and I know that's language or whatever, but it's very much economic development, community economic development, founded in the principle of being invited in to community. So I'm in this position now for about 4 months. It's about stakeholder relations, and I'm responsible for a fairly large region, and it includes 19 First Nations and 4 Métis settlements is in my region alone. And then all the municipalities and everything else as well. My question with all that background is that don't know, and I'm trying to work with colleagues within the Ministry of Indigenous Relations, and I am making connections, but I'm still would love to ask, how would you, and I know so maybe too long to answer, so we could maybe talk about this another time, but I want to be of service to my First Nations and Métis settlements. And I want to do it in a way that is equal, hopefully, or more, but at least offer equally to them as I am to all my municipalities and communities in my region, my service. And I don't know how to go about it respectfully, or lack of a better word, correctly. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice, because in my role, it is one where, for example, you mentioned the UBF, there's now the ABF. So Alberta is now funding, you know, broadband in a number of small communities in the Northwest Alberta region that I cover. And information like that, I want to be able to share with my First Nations just to make sure they're getting it in Métis settlements and more. Like my job, and I like to think I'm pretty decent at it, is connecting the dots and bringing people together, or solving sometimes problems, and or at least hearing what the issues are and bringing it back to government. So I've only been in this position for 3 months, and I haven't gone about introducing myself yet to the First Nations and Métis settlements in my region, because I want to make sure that I start off on the right foot. And it's a very big question, I know. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Derrick. Yeah.
Can I offer some advice?
Yeah, thanks, Leonard.
I'm Leonard, standing on oath, Montana First Nations. I'm the chief of my nation, but I work with all the chiefs across Alberta, and I know Chief from Woodland Cree, Isaac. Chief Isaac, he's the Grand Chief for Economic Development, but there's also the Grand Chief of the Treaty 8, is Chief Arthur Noski. And Treaty 8 office would be receptive to hear what she has to offer. Maybe work to Dr. Auger to get that introduction. So that's the only advice I can give you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Derrick, did you want to add something?
No, it's actually the same thing as what Chief just said, is that every community has a band administrator, every community in whatever form that is. You have the regional organizations, and the thing is, the most regional organizations don't trickle that information down in an effective way, and that's why CRTC doesn't talk to First Nations communities, nor does ISED. ISK is the only one, and they have a scheduled meeting typically every week with the band administrators. So having that conversation with ISK and making that request for ISK to pass on whatever information you have for your zone would be one method. The other method is directly contacting every administrator. The other method is contacting the tribal administration groups.
Okay.
So there's 3 levels of contact that you have available to you. And this is what the, like you're going through, most government employees do not understand First Nations structure of governance because they're not taught it, and it's not important. So only when it comes to having an impact or something, that a deadline coming up, do they scramble and try to figure out how they're going to do this. So it's not a taught area of information. So don't be hard on yourself. Most government officials do not know what the Indian Act says, those who work in First Nations governance. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Derrick. Josie, I saw that you unmuted. Did you want to add something? Not to put you on the spot. Don't wanna miss it.
Well, I think that it's also important to notice, like, if there's like elections happening in First Nations communities, and knowing that like the chief and councils generally have, agenda items, you might have to wait 2 months to get on the agenda, and that would be a good turnaround. So just realizing that to get started, I think would be a good thing. And just understand that if there's also that idea of reciprocity, I think is really important when you're working with like Indigenous communities. So if you have you know, just a little something to bring to the nation, find out how many people there have, whether it's like, you know, just like simple things like little token gestures like pens or something like that, to give, you know, open a door, have that conversation.
Thanks, Josie. Thanks, everyone.
Anything like that.
Also,
Yeah.
that sounds like a very big workload expectation. So that sounds really hard to navigate. Great. Well, I am so happy with our whole series. It's been so delightful to have so many folks show up and engage. And our panel today was especially engaging and dynamic, evidenced by our longest Q&A yet. So thank you to our speakers today and to everyone who attended. Please keep following what's happening with the communities in transition work. As Lorelei said at the beginning, there's lots of other things happening. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Lorelei or I. And I'll put my information in the chat. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, I put
Thanks,
my
Katie.
information in the chat as well, my email. So anyone wants to contact me, feel free.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.